Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael McNutt. I'm the Director of Education and Events for WEDI, and welcome to our special virtual spotlight, Automating Medical Necessity for Prior Authorization, sponsored and presented by MCG. It's my pleasure to introduce Raj Godavarthi, Associate Vice President of Technology and Interoperability with MCG Health.
Michael, I can take it from here.
Please do. Feel free to share your screen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Raj from MCG, so I'm going to share my screen. Thank you very much, our WEDI team and all the folks who helped us. Today, we are going to talk about one of the very important part of the prior authorization process, which is automating medical necessity for prior authorization. And we have some breaking news to share as well from CMS in a few minutes, and how this totally fits into the overall provider burden reduction and improving the patient outcomes and reducing the manual process and the utilization management. And most importantly, preserving the clinical intent as we automate a lot of these processes. So we would like to share all those details in depth with our resident expert, Lisa. And perhaps if you have time, I will also show you the demo. So just to introduce Lisa is our manager of clinical informatics team and the brain behind all the codification of clinical intent of all the guidelines and how we scale it and how we create set of algorithms and how we make it machine readable so that we can automate some of those steps. And she's going to spend a good amount of time to talk about that. And I am supporting her along with a lot of other initiatives at MCG on the interoperability side. And I'm also representing in some industry groups to promote the prior authorization processes and to reduce the burden. As time to time, we see a lot of folks from technology side will join, and not many people will know why exactly we do utilization management. And I'm going to just use a couple of minutes to set the ground for all kinds of audiences, and then we will deep dive into the documentation and automation part of it. We'll have some time for questions towards the end as well. So in the utilization review process, typically there are different types of reviews that we call prospective review, where medical necessary for the performance of services before admission, you do those things, and concurrent reviews when the patient is in inpatient or in a post-acute setting, and the retrospective reviews after the treatment is provided. So regardless where they do these reviews, identifying the medical necessity and looking at the clinical documentation that support medical necessity, those are the key factors for the providers and payers to ensure proper care is delivered and the money is exchanged between the parties as well. So as we are going to look into the deeper part of the documentation of medical necessity, we like to highlight it is important that we use the evidence-based guidelines to document the medical necessity. And then we provide all the supporting documentation in the process of automation. Right now, the industry spends enormous money and administration time to create this medical necessity review clinical documentation. And we just got a rule from CMS, and I'll share in a minute. And there are some interesting stats in that CMS proposed rule. They were saying that the total cost per individual and group physician per year is approximately $48,882. It's nearly $50,000 per individual or per group physician they're spending on the prior authorization paperwork, right? Then you can see how much time physician is spending, the RNs are spending, the clerical, and this is the time and money and the effort that's going into this burdensome process and taking away the actual time they could spend with patients or improving the patient outcomes. So I'm showing these stats just to share the burden. It may not be accurately correct for your organization, but it just gives you a sense of what is the burden would look like, and most importantly, how it is impacting the patient care when you're taking away the time from the clinicians. So part of the press, as we are preparing for this demo and this particular discussion, yesterday afternoon, we have seen CMS posted this in the Federal Registry that, in a matter of next few days, they're going to make this as a proposed rule for commenting period for next 60 days. And this advancing interoperability and improving prior authorization processes are for Medicare Advantage organizations. And then you can see the set of the organizations that they need to comply with this, this particular rule. And just to give you a few specifics as you plan to read it and comment on it, they call this proposed requirement for payers as implementing an API. This is a technology term for prior authorization requirements, documentation, and decision. So they combine these three things into the part of the rule. They call PARDD API, an interesting acronym for that. But effective date is January 1st, 2026. They say if everything goes well and they finalize the rule next year. The two pieces that I would like to highlight part of this rule, potentially as we are discussing today, then you can see how MCG is solving that problem, creating those efficiencies to address the role. The third bullet point here, you see the API or the technology should be able to query the payer's prior authorization documentation requirements to understand what are the payer's requirements are, and then make them available part of the provider workflow seamlessly. That means they're not going to another portal, they're not doing additional work, as well as compilation of all that information, which is that clinical documentation, right? And then package all that information and send it to the payer. That's the last bullet. So very, we didn't plan this rule to come, yesterday or posted, but we plan to share this information today, how we can automate some of these steps and compile all this information in a way that you're not manually doing it and the technology is doing it for you and sending it to the payer. So we'll talk about that. With that, just to highlight on the HL7 Da Vinci, where the MCG solution and the big umbrella that where this fits, we assist in the medical necessity documentation. We share this through the payer's criteria in terms of compiling the evidence of all the things that you will see shortly. And we have the capabilities to extract relevant clinical data for any particular guideline, and we package all this information to the payer. So these are all the capabilities that part of our solution provides as well. So with that, let me hand off to Lisa, who will take through a deeper dive of how we document this process. Lisa, you're there?
Yes. Oops. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to start with a couple of headlines I pulled from the news, and it really wasn't hard to find them because, as you saw, there's a lot of buzz around prior authorization, and we'll likely see more. But some of the headlines are concerning. Delayed care is care denied. There's questions around how prior auth should be carried out, the value of gold carding, portals versus APIs, how to reduce the time from initiation to determination. These are all subjects that are taking up a lot of space in the discussion threads and headlines. But really, this is only a part of the puzzle. The delays, the inefficiencies, the process overall, it's burdensome and it's ripe for automation. There's a lot we can do in this space. But as somebody who's been in health informatics for a lot of years, I wanted to bring the discussion back to the question of whether we can make prior authorization more meaningful. Can we move in a direction that's more rational and value-driven? So if you go to the next slide. From a payer and provider perspective, why are we doing all this work for prior authorization? And there are signs, and you see them all over the place, that the question of why is gaining traction. This is a quote that was taken by from the Kaiser Family Foundation, where they noted that California has laws mandating the prior authorization rules reflect accepted standards of care. Last month, Pennsylvania also passed legislation around PA that included verbiage mandating a peer review if the insurer questions medical necessity. So I think now's a really good time to take a closer look at medical necessity and that side of the the equation. Next slide. So prior authorization is a process for determining whether or not a drug, a medication, inpatient stay is medically necessary. There's a lot of requirements that are needed to support the business and cost containment side that are tied up in this process. But medical necessity is much more meaningful. Every procedure, medication, inpatient stay has the potential to cause patient harm. There's side effects, hospital-acquired infections, unfavorable outcomes. Dollars spent on unnecessary care are also a burden on the healthcare system. Medical necessity asks the fundamental question, is this treatment necessary? In the end, if prior auth doesn't support a determination of medical necessity, we're really not solving the problem. Next one. And there's 3 clicks to this one. If you want to just go ahead, yeah. So this is where clinical informatics comes in. For those of you who are not familiar with this discipline, clinical informatics is kind of at the intersection of where technology, best practices, and patient data come together. So as informaticists, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the problem to be solved? And the second one is, can we solve it with the information we have available? So there's a lot of cool tools out there and methodologies, but applying the right solution and knowing when automation can do the job and when human intervention is necessary, that's really the key to all of it. There should always be an overarching motivation to support the right care. Next one. And this is just a little bit about our approach. It's very straightforward. We're very lucky here at MCG because we have a long history with developing standards and guidelines, and they're in wide use throughout the industry. We have a team of physician and nurse editors who evaluate the evidence, they grade it, and they make that difficult call around whether there is, in fact, sufficient evidence to support a particular intervention or treatment. As informaticists, our group builds on that knowledge, so determining whether sufficient data can be pulled from the patient records to say that this criteria can be satisfied. We are very fortunate that we have the subject matter experts available to us, so we actually go back then and confirm with them that the collection of facts that we pull from the patient record is sufficient to support the stated criteria. And if anybody on this call has ever taken part in the CMS quality measures, they know the difficulty of assembling the team of SMEs together and getting timely feedback. So this is an advantage our team certainly leverages. We have another advantage from a clinical rules perspective. We can capture the human reviewer's response to the data we surface. So we can use the utilization management reviewer's decisions, whether they select or ignore a recommendation, as yet another data point to continuously improve the quality of our algorithms. And of course, the last step is always to take those learnings, incorporate them back into our rules, refining and improving our accuracy to establish the basis of medical necessity. So let's take a look at what this looks like. We have a very simple design. The clinical data from the provider EHR is on the right-hand panel. The criteria from the policy or guideline is on the left. The patient data that satisfies an indication or criteria is displayed as matched underneath that criteria. And if the user selects the criteria with its associated data, both the criteria and the clinical data is incorporated into the review. We also capture metadata around the user behavior for analysis. Go ahead to the next one. So tying it all together here. The provider staff launches the application within the EMR. The relevant data is extracted. Our reasoning engine looks for data that satisfies our criteria, which we surface as matches. The provider confirms, they add attachments and answer any questions that require a human. This information then gets brought together for the reviewer and is submitted to the payer. Next slide, please. So by combining rules, data, and user behavior, we're able to develop a pathway towards intelligent learning, not just machine learning, but training by subject matter experts at every step in the process. Automation is baked into the process, but the payoff is really establishing whether the care being requested is the right care. Go ahead. An example here shows a patient under the guideline for COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and the data elements we identified, including respiratory rate, pulse, blood pressure. That's what we see in highlighted in blue here. If you can go to the next one, Raj. What I want to call out, though, is what's more important than the data we identified. It's the data that we didn't match on. So in this screenshot, we see the patient had some O2 sats that were concerning. They're rather low, but the clinical criteria itself is very specific in the context of this chronic condition. We're not just looking for low O2 sats. We're looking for new onset hypoxemia that persists despite observation care. The clinical data for this patient shows improving oxygenation. So while they might have come into the hospital with concerning readings, they don't meet the intent of the criteria for this particular piece of criteria, which is to distinguish patients whose oxygen level can be managed from those who are going to require more intensive intervention. Next slide. And we can actually skip this one. Let's just go to the one after that. So in this example, I'm going to take you through what one of our rules look like. And this is an indication under our systemic or infectious condition guideline. The content authors created a definition for identifying severe electrolyte abnormality. This definition has several components, but this particular indication is looking for a sodium level less than 135 MEQs with a severe finding that requires inpatient care. So working with our content authors, we're able to write a rule that's specific to the set of severe findings that might be expected in this setting. And we have what we euphemistically call a human readable translation here. But it describes the rule that the indication captures. So in this case, the patient's most recent corrected sodium is less than 135 MEQs within the prior 24 hours, and the patient has either a condition in the value set for seizure within the prior 24 hours or satisfies the definition for altered mental status. And we use corrected sodium because hyperglycemia can impact those sodium readings. An important point that I wanted to call out here is that our criteria is not intended to identify every permutation or edge case for what might be considered a serious finding in the context of low sodium. We're looking for the data that a reasonable clinician would observe and say, this patient needs additional care. So now we'll go to the next slide and take a look at the workflow again. So the user calls the clinical guideline or policy. The relevant data gets extracted from the EHR, matched against the established rules. The user can agree or disagree with the recommendations surfaced in the application, and the package gets submitted to the payer. That's the process. But the advantages are far more wide-reaching. In the previous slide, I showed what happens when we find clinical criteria that satisfies an indication. But like I said, clinical data is not always clear-cut. And this is where, grading can become a critical component. EHRs can use general codes. We found this to be especially true in the instance of altered mental status. You can state the broad condition of altered mental status, but this isn't really specific enough to meet our criteria, which is looking for more granular insight. Is the patient confused? Are they lethargic, obtunded? Are they comatose? While we identify the condition of altered mental status, so we surface that up to the user is still required to select the more specific description of that patient's status. And so in this way, you're satisfying the criteria that is evidence-based, and you have a result that will stand up from both a quality and a legislative or regulatory perspective. So each of these steps, the intent of the indication, the confirmation of results, the internal review, external learning, and refinement, they come together to build concepts that can define medical necessity for our patients, our providers, and our payers. We can overlay business rules, but they should really be on top of a solid foundation of patient-centric focus so that the processes, the requirements, inpatient, outpatient, step therapy, all of those should be secondary to the most important question: is this care medically necessary? Is the treatment appropriate? And my question is, can we bring more than just an accelerated process into the prior authorization discussions? Can we bring the patient back into the question? And with that, I will hand it back to you, Raj.
Lisa, can you also talk about this right side, how we validate false negatives and all that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So when we were talking about that iterative process where we take data back, we capture the results that you see in that upper left-hand corner there from the patient's results, and we vet those with our content subject matter experts to say, given this collection of data, is this in fact sufficient to describe medical necessity in the context of this criteria or indication? Then we go from there and we take a look all the way down the path. We see the crosswalk between, from a payer perspective, our payers agreeing with us that this collection of clinical data is in fact sufficient to satisfy the criteria. And then we go back and we look and we see when there's a difference, when a provider thinks that somebody meets and we don't, we would call that a false negative in our analysis. We go in and we take a look and we say, is there something in the collection of data that if we were to aggregate it and pull it together would be another indication that the patient does in fact warrant care? So an example of that really was in the case of respiratory distress. We noticed that respiratory distress was getting triggered on patients that we did not see, that we didn't see O2 sats that were concerning on it. We didn't see any of the traditional symptoms or conditions that we would expect with that. However, we were able to find emergent intubation as one of the collection of data elements that were on their profile. And so in the context of pneumonia, we would assert that being emergently intubated is definitely a condition that that defines necessity in the case of respiratory distress. In the case of seizure, if we were to look at it in the context of another guideline, maybe it's more airway protection. But all these things get pulled together, again, refining, questioning, evaluating how we can do a better job on this.
Thanks, Lisa. So just to talk about a few things Lisa mentioned. One is the process through which we develop the underlying algorithms to say whether medical necessity is cleanly preserved or the clinical intent is properly documented, right? It's not just technology identifying this question, this answer. This is a clinical judgment. It should preserve that. The clinical documentation integrity, they call, this has a very high standard in the industry. So MCG strives to not only create algorithms to preserve that clinical content as they collect the data about that particular patient record, but also reviews that information with our clinical data experts internally, because as provider and the automation selects all this information, submits to payer, if this information is not reducing the burden eventually, then nobody would use this. This information should preserve the clinical judgment, and the payer should see this as a valuable information so that they can make a clinical determination in an automated fashion. So it is our job to continue to refine these algorithms to the point we preserve the clinical intent. It's not about automating the decisions for the sake of automating. It is end of the day, it's going to impact the patient care based on the decisions both sides make. And if we continue to provide a valuable information to the payer with the package of all the clinical data, payers would be able to use that to automate these decisions as well. In addition to that, we also intend to look at the claim outcomes, based on all the documentation that we have surfaced and submitted to the payer. What are the claim outcomes are saying eventually? Are there things that we can learn based on the claims as well? So we have an internal process to review based on the user selections and how payers are treating that clinical decision support, and also the process to look at the claim outcomes to see how those results are matching. So this is an iterative process using subject matter experts on the physicians and clinician side, as well as our informatics team, so that when we create an algorithm like this, for every question in a guideline, MCG has hundreds and hundreds of guidelines for inpatient, outpatient, and the continuum of care for every other guideline as well. We have created a dedicated team to manage this evidence of the whole informatics teams, preserving the clinical intent and creating these rules, creating these algorithms, so that when we match this data with a clinical record, we are confident to say what we are saying is true, right? Because we are an evidence-based company. Everything we do, we want to make sure it is fully, something we can back. So just to give you some of the technologies or some of the layers that we use behind, and after that I will show you demos through which we can see all these things in for real as well. So MCG built this platform over years, right? MCG, known for evidence-based guidelines from 1980s. So that is, 30, 40 years of experience built in terms of providing the clinical content for the industry. So that is our foundational layer. Everything we do is evidence-based, highly trusted by payers and providers. And this is, continuously revised based on the industry evidence and how things are happening in the industry. And then over the years, we started codifying this. This is what Lisa was showing. We have taken these guidelines and make it machine readable. That means that if you take these questions and match with the clinical data, can we match the results, right? Without having humans continue to see the two screens and select it. So as Lisa mentioned, we created a team and we are continuing to codifying all these guidelines. And we have done hundreds and hundreds of guidelines over the last few years that they are machine readable. And we do use machine learning solutions where it is appropriate, especially when you have a clinical notes, which is unstructured, when you have radiology impression notes where it is unstructured. We do use the machine learning models to surface the appropriate evidence. And I will show you one of that example in a few minutes. And then the third layer we built based on content and codification. Now we surface the auto documentation. Maybe there is a very loaded phrase here. We mean to say we tell what are the things that are matched based on the data that we found in the clinical record. Now it is up to the provider and payer how they wanted to trust that process. We recommend somebody to just take a quick glance and confirm our findings, because we surface this for this question. Here is the supporting data we found in the clinical record. And one could automate that process as well if they deem that is appropriate for them. And we also automate the steps in the workflow. So for example, in the provider setting, as they place the order, it automatically surfaces all the information to the provider within their workflows. They don't have to log in some other place. We have this built into Epic platform right now. So where one provider network is already using. So that is our third layer. Starts with content, then we codify it, and then we surface the auto documentation part. And then once you have all this information, now we are ready to make some decisions. If the MCG clinical criteria is met, if MCG recommendation based on the matches is that this is sufficient enough for admission or a procedure, you could write a rule saying that for this code, for this one, if coming from this provider, I would like to automate the decision as well, right? Whatever the decisions your organization is doing based on the business and clinical rules, we provide that rules engine on top of these three layers so that you can automate that process and communicate to the providers. And finally, this is all built based on the standards, because if you were intended to operate between all the systems between provider and payer and all the standards that we need to comply with, whether it is FHIR or X12 or you're using your own APIs, we intended to build a real-time bidirectional data exchange where when the information going from provider with all the clinical documentation to the payer, and if payer says, I need more information, and that information seamlessly flow between back and forth between these systems. So that is the bidirectional data exchange platform we have built, and that is already in production as well. So these are the 5 layers. It is not just having one piece that would do the work. And if we are trying to solve this problem and scale between thousands and thousands of payers and providers, we need to have all these layers that works with where the payers are and where the providers are. And that is a platform we have built, and many of our payers are implementing right now. So just to bring it all together before I switch to demo, so you have some of the current processes just described right now. A lot of people are using either fax or portal, and where they get all the auth requests, and they have a staff to review all those cases and make the decisions. But the way we envision the future, however the information is coming either through fax or portal or EHR, or sometimes payers saying that we would like to use all this automation on the utilization management on their side until there is enough adoption on the provider side, which means that they're going to convert the fax and portals and then adjudicate rest of the process using our automation. So however they do it, once the information is triggered for a particular order, you can see in step 1, we can automate based on the authorization metadata, which means somebody is asking for, this provider is asking for this particular code or this particular procedure or diagnosis. So just with the authorization metadata, we have rules engine that would check the eligibility, and that would check, does it require prior auth? If it doesn't require prior auth, and if the rules engine says it is automated and I approve this, we will automate that whole process without ever needing the clinical documentation. The second step is there are cases where payer says we would need more clinical documentation. In such cases, we would go and extract the clinical data. If this clinical data is coming from EMRs, we have the CQL, the FHIR language to go and extract it. And if payer says that I have all this information in my longitudinal database, we could go where the data is. It doesn't have to be the provider. We could even work with the Epic Payer platform where a lot of payers are extracting all the data. The point here is that it's not necessarily, we have to connect to the providers. It is automating the decision-making process where the data is and where it makes more sense. So if this is all happening on the payer side, and that is improving the patient outcomes, that's where we will go and fit. So we could use all the data that is available on the payer side based on the request that is coming, and then surface all the auto documentation, auto approval process using the technologies we have talked about. And finally, step 3 is that we have to make this available and work with all the systems between provider and payer. Sometimes within the payer itself, you have 3 or 4 systems that combines all these workflows. So not every system is FHIR compliant today, or not every system is capable to support interoperability standards. But we work with what you have. Like if you have your custom APIs, we would take what it is and plug in all the pieces between payer to provider or within the payer sides so that we can communicate all this information. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and I'm going to stop for a second so that I can open the demo screen here. So we're going to show how all these things will come together in terms of a patient and a scenario here. So I'm going to share my screen, and this is a very rich demo here we're going to show. So we're going to use a patient information here. So we are using a simulator that MCG has built to create a patient context and to show how this information will show to an EM reviewer, whether it is on payer or provider side for a pneumonia use case. Lisa, if you don't mind, can you talk through it? I will show all the pieces here.
Sure. So we have in this example, we have a hypoxemia definition, and in this case, we are looking for oxygen saturations based on their O2 levels. And so we're able to find clinical data in here that is able to assert that the patient does not have a baseline need for supplemental oxygen. And now they clearly do have a need for it because they have a partial pressure of less than 60 and their O2 sats are below 90. So that information gets captured, it gets put underneath the clinical criteria that you see on the left-hand side. And if, Raj, if you want to select that, if you just want to click on the, and click on the preview button up at the top, there you go. You see that that information gets captured there. So not only the clinical criteria, but the context in which it occurs, right? This is the picture essentially of what represents hypoxemia for this patient in this indication.
Thank you, Lisa. I think just to add a few other things, right? As soon as we launched this screen, we didn't do anything, right? We extracted all the data that is available, whether this information is available on the EMR side. And lately we have been working with payers where they have all this information as well. So we could extract all this information because we know for this particular pneumonia guideline, what are the data elements we would need. So this is where the Lisa's expertise of codification. So we would look at our clinical intent of our criteria and we say, these are all the data elements we would need to match this criteria to automate the documentation part. So here you can see we could extract problems and we can even do calculators like, if there is a pneumonia severity index and things like that, we use calculators as well. The procedures, the vitals, the labs, medications. And the example I want to show here is when there is unstructured data that we use the NLP models, the machine learning models to say, you have like, 10, 20, 30 pages of this notes comes in, and how do you know what are the information that you need to highlight so that you can highlight on the left side as well. So as you see here, we have highlighted this patient is immunocompromised because we see this information is available in the patient H&P, and these pages and pages of notes, our machine learning models will read it and highlight wherever that evidence they find so that they can see here and they can see and they can select or they can confirm our findings. So the process is to not only look at what data is available if it is all structured, because when we codify it and we say, if the lab value is this, and if we say hypoxemia, oxygen saturation is this, we can create a clinical semantic language to do that. That is one step MCG can qualify. And also we are very solid in terms of creating those rules because of our expertise. And the second step is where the data is not structured, where you find a lot of data in the notes and radiology impression notes and things like that, how you use the appropriate technology to highlight the evidence. Because this alone will save a lot of time for a reviewer rather than having them read pages and pages and interpret and check these boxes. So when MCG looks at a solution as a whole, we look at, how do we reduce the burden for a reviewer, whether it is on the provider side and payer side? How do we auto assist in the documentation process? How do you put all these things together in a way that we can compile this and give it to payer so that payer is not spending a lot of time to see why did they ask for this one? They can see all this information in a very structured and packaged way so that they can automate their process as well. So this is what MCG has been working on, and we are very good at because of our background. So I hope this demo kind of brings it all together. So just to close before we go to the question and answer session. So as a summary, we do assist in medical necessity documentation. The reason we don't want to call it automate is we wanted to also preserve the clinical reviewers personal discretion at times. So automation is a judgment, right? We would say this is what we recommend. Somebody could say that is good enough to automate, right? We will leave it that to the users. But MCG is capable to surface all the evidence part of the documentation when we automate that step. So in this process, our goal is to preserve the clinical judgment, right? This is where we can use a lot of machine learning technologies, but we have to be very careful, right? Does the machine know how to grade a question like, does the patient is responding despite treatment, right? So somebody could say you need 3 readings or you need 4 readings before you say, it persists pain despite treatment. These are the things that we could say, but somebody need to review it. So we need to preserve that clinical judgment in the process of automating this highlighting documentation. And then we must use the standards so that we can scale. When we present this solution to the industry, they say, how do you scale to hundreds of these physician hospitals, right? That's where we are using these standards, right? If somebody is on Epic and Cerner or Athena or Allscripts, and they are subject to support these standards from ONC, and then when we enhance or when we scale this, we are using the same implementation for all providers. And you need to have a certain level of expertise to codify this criteria. Not everybody can do this, because the people who are creating this evidence know exactly what is the intent of that question or questionnaire when they create this. And this need to be revised annually, because you have a lot of evidence coming in. You have to make sure that you are incorporating proper evidence, and then you codify that criteria. So that is what MCG's bread and butter is. And we use terminology services as we codify, so that we can interact with a data set based on the value set. So this is part of our algorithm buildings. And then we use machine learning as appropriate, as I've shown you. And we package all these things. We package all this information in a way payers can use it and structure it if they wanted to create rules on top of it. So that is part of the CMS requirements you have seen as well. And one of the other thing that we could do is that a lot of customers ask for this as well. So if you know what data elements you would need for a particular criteria, and if that information is not coming through from the provider, can you tell them what exactly is missing, right? Because we know what criteria we are looking for to automate the documentation or to assist the documentation. There are times we can tell we are not getting the vitals from the last 2 days, or we didn't have enough information from the labs to make decision. So when you send an information back to the provider, what is missing, we can also tell exactly what is missing, right? We identify what exactly is missing based on our codification, and we can communicate rather than saying insufficient information or submit more clinicals. Often we heard that is one of the pain points. So our rules algorithms can identify those, what is missing or insufficient. Finally, this should integrate with your systems where they are, right? Whether you're using on the payer side utilization management or on the provider side. We have a Smart on Fire app built for the providers that seamlessly integrates. We are the first in the nation to do that, and we are the first in the nation to implement that with the payer and provider. And we are working with our payers to implement on their payer side, where they have all the data, where they have processes to do the intake, and they wanted to automate as well. Wherever they do it, wherever the data is, our solution will fit right, where the information is. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen and I look at questions so that we can surface more. So I'm looking at questions. Lisa, can you answer one question we typically get, that in terms of guidelines that are codified, how many of them we have codified? What is the percentage, and how do you communicate that information?
So we try to address the which guidelines and how many, really looking at what provides the greatest value to our clients. So we've observed that, even though MCG has many guidelines, it's a much smaller percentage that actually get leveraged for the purposes of admission documentation. And so codification in that area is really targeted towards addressing the ones that are the most frequently used indications and guidelines for it. We have over 200 guidelines now that have codification available to them, and that's always increasing and being refined. What was the second part of your question?
Then how do we scale it annually as things change, right? What kind of process you have to ensure the clinical judgment is preserved over the years? Things change.
So that's actually a really good question, because that's one of the things that in seeing, because prior auth and all of these documentation issues are very popular, shall we say, a hot topic in the market right now. There's a lot of focus on, oh, we can do it like magic. We can get it done like this. But it's really not that easy, right? And that's not the way you want to approach it. There might be ways to take collections of patient data and saying, oh, so the patients who were approved for a specific, under a specific condition, all had these things in common. And say, so we're going to say that anybody with this collection of data is appropriate for admission based on the fact that the patients with similar data got approved in the past. But really, that's not what medical necessity is about, right? Medical necessity is about being prospective. And so as the evidence changes, as the recommendations change, as the different learnings become available to us, we want to incorporate that not only into our content, but into our rules as well. And so some of the concepts that we're able to capture are somewhat more static in terms of, how you determine a patient that has, that has low oxygenation. And some of them are more dynamic, and they change with different tests that are available and different things that come out. And so we try to get in front of those new things so that we're representing the standards as they are today, the best possible information that we can provide to say that this patient, according to what we know, is appropriate for admission or is appropriate for this procedure or whatever it is that the criteria is looking for.
Thanks, Lisa. I will answer some other questions. Which EMRs are integrated with? As of now, we have an official app on Epic, and we are working with a few others, but most of the providers are not still there yet in terms of providing all the required support. Epic is only one of them started this work early. So we are integrated, or we are certified with Epic and working with a few others. Do you have any provider group adoption stats? We will share that information probably in January webinar. You will see a monthly webinar from January onwards on our implementation stats, what we have done. Do you convert 5 to 278? Yes, we do. That's what I mentioned. Based on what you have, we will do it. If you're using 278 or custom API or FHIR, doesn't matter. We will convert to the system that you accept, and we will convert to 278 to FHIR or 278 to custom API, whatever the systems that you are comfortable with. And then, does MCG makes its APIs available to EHR so they can compare data on their system? Absolutely. We do have that capability as well, Gaurav. So happy to discuss a little more. Feel free to shoot a note. How is this auth request initiated? So this request is initiated in two ways. One is, if the provider is placing an order, the technology allows to initiate the order at the point there is a signed order on the provider side EMR, so that we can initiate the request, taking that order sign information and telling the payer, hey, somebody's asking for this particular order. Does it require prior auth? If it requires prior auth, what are the clinical documentation requirements? So we can literally initiate at the provider when they sign the order, or whoever the back office person work process is. Also, we can initiate this process on the payer side when the intake comes. So we have payers who are taking the intake from portals and also faxes and convert into a digital record. And we can trigger the whole process from that point onwards. So wherever it is relevant. Are you doing anything regarding automating PA submitted via faxes? So we have some partnerships on this end with payers who are doing a lot of digitization on the faxes already. And we are working with them to initiate the process from that point onwards. Do you have any examples of payer provider APIs that you have integrated with? Absolutely. We can share that information with you, Jimmy. Can you provide more info on the metadata around human behavior? What are you capturing? How is it captured? What Lisa was trying to mention at that point is that when we highlight the evidence to the criteria and say, for hypoxemia, for oxygen saturation rate, here is the data we found, and we highlight that question. When user confirms that finding, that means that they agree with our findings. When user didn't select that finding and they're selecting something else, that means that they didn't agree with our finding, at least in that particular context. So we just collect what exactly user is eventually selecting before they submit to the payer, so that we understand if there is an opportunity for us to refine our algorithms. So that's what we are capturing, not necessarily any other information. So there is a 90-day commenting period, of course, on the proposed rule. And we are very excited about that, because this will reduce the burden for the providers. This will reduce the burden for the payers. Ultimately, it improves the patient outcomes. And what MCG has been doing, and MCG is partnering with a lot of other vendors and payers and providers as well, is that we know what it means to say when medical necessity criteria is met or not met, and even auto assist in the documentation. That is our core competency. And our job is to provide the technology in a way that we can automate and integrate wherever the partners, payers, and providers would like to use it. So those are all the questions I have. With that, thank you very much for your time today. Michael?
Excellent. Raj, Lisa, thank you so much for being a part of this event. And thank you so much for MCG for being the presenter and sponsor for this event. Are there any additional questions in the chat? All right, if that's no more questions for today, we would like to thank you for attending this MCG sponsored presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at another WEDI event.
Thank you all.